Sometime around 1330 BC, thousands of men were given an order that had never been given in the history of Egypt: to climb the temples, the obelisks, the sacred walls no one had dared touch for 1,000 years, and to erase the name of a god, not just any god, the king of the gods, Amun, the most powerful god in Egypt, worshipped for centuries, owner of more gold and more land than the pharaoh himself. Across all of Egypt, his name was scraped from the stone, from the temples, from the tombs, even from the name of the dead pharaoh, the very father of the man who gave the order. A pharaoh had decided that 1,000 years of religion were wrong, that all the gods of Egypt were a lie, that there was only one, and that he was the only man on earth allowed to speak with him. His name was Akhenaten, and in just 17 years, he tried to do something no ruler in history had ever attempted: to erase the gods of an entire people and replace them with a single one. He almost destroyed Egypt in the process. And when he died, Egypt itself tried to erase him back, to pretend he had never existed. This is the story of the heretic Pharaoh, the man who saw a single god 1,000 years before the rest of the world and nearly took the greatest empire on earth down with his vision. The story of his queen, as powerful as he was and even more mysterious, and the story of how 3,000 years later he was pulled back out of the sand to ask the world a question that 3 religions still cannot answer. To understand the scale of what Akhenaten tried to do, you first have to understand the Egypt he inherited. Because he was not born into a weak empire, he was born at the absolute peak of the greatest civilization in the world. We are in the 18th dynasty, around 1350 BC. Egypt is a superpower. Its empire stretches from Sudan to Syria. The gold of Nubia flows into the pharaoh's coffers. Foreign kings send gifts, daughters in marriage, requests for alliance. Egypt is as rich as it had ever been, and ever would be. And at the center of all that wealth was a power that rivaled the pharaoh's own: the priesthood of Amun. Amun was the king of the gods, the hidden god, the invisible one, who had merged with the sun god Ra to become Amun-Ra, the supreme deity of Egypt. And his temple at Karnak, in the city of Thebes, was not merely a place of worship. It was a machine of power. The priests of Amun controlled immense treasures. They owned land across Egypt. They had granaries, cattle, ships, armies of workers. Some historians estimate the Temple of Amun controlled an enormous slice of the Egyptian economy. It was, in practice, a state within a state, a power the pharaoh had to court in order to rule. No Egyptian king ascended the throne without the blessing of the priests of Amun. They crowned the king. They interpreted the will of the god. They were in many ways as much the owners of Egypt as the man on the throne. And this is where the detail comes in that will explain everything that follows. Because when a young prince, thin, strange in appearance, came to the throne of Egypt, he looked at that immense power of the priests, and according to how many historians read it, he did not see faith. He saw a rival he decided to destroy at the root. But to do that, he would need something stronger than an army. He would need a new god. Akhenaten's father was one of the greatest pharaohs in history, Amenhotep III. His reign was a golden age of peace and monumental building. He ruled in Egypt at its peak for almost 40 years, so sure of his own power that he declared himself a living god while still alive. And there's a curious detail. Akhenaten may not even have been meant to be pharaoh. He had an older brother, Thutmose, the expected heir, who died young. It was his brother's death that set the strange second son on the path to the throne. An accident of fate placed the most radical mind in Egyptian history into power, and the son's name, at first, honored the very god he would one day try to destroy, because he was born Amenhotep, the fourth to bear that name, too. And Amenhotep means Amun is satisfied. Notice the irony that runs through this whole story. The man who would try to erase Amun from Egypt was born with the name of Amun carved into his own. There's something else about him we have to face, because it leaps out from every statue that survived. Look at this face, it looks like no other pharaoh. Pharaohs were always depicted as perfect, young, athletic, gods in human form. Akhenaten had himself depicted in a shocking way. An elongated skull, a long narrow face, full lips, a prominent belly, wide hips, thin limbs. For more than a century, scholars have debated what this means. Was it a real disease, something that deformed his body? Some suggested Marfan syndrome, which elongates the bones. Others, hormonal disorders. Was it a deliberate artistic style? Or was it theology in the form of art? A way of showing the pharaoh as a being beyond the human, beyond male and female, in the image of his new god who also had no form. The honest truth is that we don't know. Examinations of mummies that may be his have given no definitive answer. The face of Akhenaten remains one of the unsolved mysteries of archaeology, but whatever the reason for that appearance, it is almost a perfect symbol of the man, because everything about Akhenaten was different, strange, against tradition. And nothing was more against tradition than the decision he made a few years after taking the throne. A decision that began small, almost tolerable, and grew until it became an obsession capable of breaking Egypt. At the start of his reign, still as Amenhotep IV, the young pharaoh began to favor a specific god. Not exactly a new god. It was an ancient aspect of the sun, called the Aten, the solar disk. The physical disk of the sun itself in the sky. Other pharaohs had paid worship to the Aten before. At first, it didn't look like a revolution. It looked only like a personal preference of the king for one deity among many. But Akhenaten kept taking it further. First, he built temples to the Aten right beside the great temple of Amun at Karnak, as a direct provocation to the priesthood. Then he began to represent the Aten in a completely new way, not as a man with an animal's head, like the other Egyptian gods, but as a disk in the sky, from which rays came down, and each ray ended in a small hand. Hands that touched the pharaoh and his family, offering them the sign of life. It was an image without precedent, a god with no human or animal face, only light that reached out in hands. And then, around the 5th year of his reign, he took the step that changed everything. He stopped saying the Aten was the greatest of the gods. He began to say the Aten was the only god, and that all the others, Amun, Osiris, Isis, Horus, all the gods Egypt had worshipped for 1,000 years, simply did not exist. Think about what this meant to an Egyptian of that time. It wasn't switching religions, it was being told that everything your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents had believed for 1,000 years was a lie. That the gods who protected your home, who cared for your dead, who made the Nile rise were not real. That there was only the sun and a single man on earth allowed to speak with it. That man was Akhenaten. Because the new religion held a brilliant and unsettling detail. The people did not pray to the Aten directly. The Aten communicated only with Akhenaten and his family. The pharaoh was the sole intermediary between the one god and humanity. To reach God, you had to go through him. And here the political masterstroke becomes clear. Remember the priests of Amun, that state within a state, owners of half the wealth of Egypt. With a single theological decision, Akhenaten made them useless. Without Amun, there was no temple of Amun. Without a temple of Amun, there was no priesthood of Amun. Without a priesthood, there was no rival. It was the greatest power grab in Egyptian history. And he did it all in the name of God. But Akhenaten was not alone on this throne. Beside him, in almost every image, appears a woman. And not behind him the way queens were usually shown, but the same size, on the same level, sometimes doing things only the pharaoh was allowed to do. Her name was Nefertiti, and she may have been the most powerful person in Egypt after the king himself. Perhaps at certain moments, even more powerful. You have probably seen her face even without knowing the name. The bust of Nefertiti, sculpted more than 3,000 years ago and found in the ruins of a workshop at Amarna, is one of the most reproduced images in the history of art. The long neck, the face of near-perfect symmetry, the blue crown, a universal symbol of beauty. But Nefertiti was much more than a beautiful face. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and she was the great royal wife of Akhenaten, his partner in the religious revolution, and a figure of a power almost no Egyptian queen had before or after. Notice what the art of that time shows about her. In some reliefs, Nefertiti appears the same size as the pharaoh, which was extremely rare, because hierarchy in Egypt was shown through the size of the figures. In others, she makes offerings to the Aten alone, a priestly role that normally belonged only to the king. And there are even images, disturbing for the era, in which she appears in the classic pose of the victorious Pharaoh, striking enemies with a mace, crushing the adversaries of Egypt. That was an image of power reserved for kings. And there she is, a queen, making the conqueror's gesture. Some Egyptologists have gone further and raised a fascinating hypothesis. What if Nefertiti was not merely the wife? What if in the last years of the reign she rose even higher, becoming co-regent, ruling alongside her husband almost as a pharaoh? And there's a bolder theory still, seriously debated among specialists, that after Akhenaten's death, Nefertiti may have taken the throne alone under a new name, ruling Egypt as king, in fact, before the arrival of the boy Tutankhamun. There is no consensus on this. It is one of the great debates of Egyptology, and it stands here as theory, not fact. But the very fact that it is a serious hypothesis says a great deal about the exceptional power of this woman. And here comes one of the greatest mysteries of the whole story. Because Nefertiti, this immensely powerful woman, present in almost every image of the early years, simply disappears from the records before the end of the reign, with no clear explanation, with no tomb known for certain, with no body identified. One of the most important women of the ancient world evaporated from history, and no one knows to this day what happened to her. The search for the mummy of Nefertiti remains one of the great hunts of modern archaeology. Some mummies have been put forward as candidates, and there was even a theory that she was hidden in a secret chamber behind the wall of Tutankhamun's tomb, though the scans carried out did not confirm it. So far, no identification has won the debate. The beautiful one who came departed without a trace, and while the royal couple reigned in the splendor of their new faith, Akhenaten was preparing his most radical gesture of all, to turn his back on the very capital of Egypt. Thebes was the city of Amun. It was contaminated in Akhenaten's eyes by the god he wanted to erase. So he did something no pharaoh had done. He abandoned the capital. He chose a stretch of virgin desert in the middle of Egypt, where there had never been any city, where no ancient god had ever been worshipped. Clean land with no past, no other gods. And there, from nothing, he ordered an entire capital to be built. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, the place where the sun rose for his god. Today we know the place by its modern Arabic name, Amarna. The city was raised at astonishing speed in just a few years. Palaces, temples, residences, artists' workshops, houses for the workers, warehouses, a royal road along which the pharaoh paraded in his golden chariot. A complete capital for tens of thousands of people, sprouting from the sand where before there was nothing. And Akhenaten made a vow. He had it carved into stelae, cut into the rock around the city. The promise that he would never leave, that this was the territory of the Aten forever. He locked himself, willingly, into his perfect world. The temples of Amarna were unlike anything before. Traditional Egyptian temples were dark, closed, mysterious, with the god's sanctuary hidden in the depths, where only the priests entered by torchlight. The temples of the Aten were the opposite, open to the sky, roofless, flooded with sunlight, because the god was the sun, and the sun needed to enter. There was no statue of the god to hide. The god was up there, visible to all, shining over altars heaped with offerings. And here too the pharaoh's own name changed. He had been born Amenhotep. Amun is satisfied. He could no longer carry the name of the god he hated. So he changed it to Akhenaten, which means roughly, he who is useful to the Aten or living spirit of the Aten. He erased Amun even from his own name. In Amarna, isolated in his sacred desert, with his family, his god and his new city, Akhenaten seemed to have won. He had his perfect world, but it was precisely that isolation that planted the seed of catastrophe, because while the pharaoh composed hymns to the sun, out there, on the borders of the empire, Egypt was beginning to crumble, and no one was watching. Before we reach the collapse, we have to stop at a single text, because to truly understand Akhenaten, it isn't enough to see him as a clever politician destroying rivals. There was something more in him, something bordering on genuine religious fervor. And that something lives in a poem. Akhenaten is credited with composing the great hymn to the Aten, found carved in one of the tombs of Amarna. And setting aside all the controversy, it must be said, it is a text of genuine beauty. The hymn describes a single God who creates and sustains absolutely everything. It speaks of dawn, when the sun rises and the whole world awakens. Men wake, the herds graze, the birds take flight, the fish leap in the river. Everything lives because the light has returned. And it speaks of night, when the sun sets and the world sinks into darkness and fear, as if each nightfall were a small death. It even describes the baby inside its mother's womb, and the chick inside the egg that peeps to receive air, all receiving the breath of life from that same God. It is a vision of a universal God, the creator of all peoples, not only of Egypt. A God who made Syria and Nubia and the land of Egypt, and gave each people its own language and the color of its skin. For the time, this was a thought of breathtaking scope, the idea that the same God cared for all men, even foreigners, even enemies. And here there is a detail we will keep for the end of this documentary, because it links Akhenaten to something far greater than Egypt. The scholars who read this hymn, when it was finally deciphered, noticed that certain passages of it bear an unsettling resemblance to a sacred text that would be written centuries later on the other side of the desert. But we'll get there. For now, hold on to this image. A pharaoh sitting in his city in the desert, writing poetry about the light that gives life to all creation. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, governors loyal to Egypt were writing a very different kind of letter, letters crying for help, and no one was answering them. Here, archaeology gave us a rare and extraordinary window into the collapse, because in the ruins of Amarna, the excavators found an archive. Hundreds of clay tablets written in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the time. These are the famous Amarna letters, and what they reveal is devastating. They are letters from kings and governors who were vassals of Egypt, scattered across the Levant and Syria, writing to the pharaoh. And many of them are pleas for help. Allied cities under attack, enemy kingdoms advancing. Loyal governors begging for Egyptian troops, for gold, for an answer that did not come. Let me take you inside one of these letters so you can feel what it was. A governor by torchlight dictating to a scribe surrounded by threat. Byblos under siege. There was a man named Ribhadda, governor of the city of Byblos on the coast of present-day Lebanon, a loyal ally of Egypt, and as a rival power advanced over the neighboring cities, one by one, Ribhadda wrote to the pharaoh, and wrote, and wrote. His letters are one of the most anguished records of the ancient world. He reports that the cities around him are falling, that his own allies are abandoning him, that he is surrounded, isolated, with his food running out. He begs for a small detachment of Egyptian soldiers. Dozens of letters over years, the tone rising from formal request to pure despair. In one of them, he practically screams through the writing. He asks why the pharaoh has abandoned his cities, why he leaves him alone before the enemy. The essential help never came in the measure that was needed. Byblos and its loyal governor were, in the end, left to their fate. While the borders of the empire burned, the pharaoh was in Amarna, absorbed in his religious revolution, composing hymns to the solar disk. We don't know exactly how much territory Egypt lost in that period. Historians debate the scale of the damage, and some argue part of the crisis predated his reign. But the overall picture is clear. Under Akhenaten, Egypt retreated in the world. The superpower inherited from his father shrank, weakened, lost allies and prestige. The pharaoh who wanted to be closer to God left his kingdom closer to the abyss. Hook. And while the empire fell apart on the outside, on the inside, the Egyptian people were living through something even deeper and crueler. Because Akhenaten's revolution struck not only the distant kings and the wealthy priests, it struck every common family in the most intimate place there is, the way they mourned their dead. This is the part of the story that is almost never told, and it may be the most human of all. For the common Egyptian, religion was not about the golden temple of Amun, which he would never enter. It was about death, about what comes after. And at the heart of that hope stood Osiris, the god who had died and risen, the lord of the world of the dead, the one who promised eternal life to those who followed him and passed the judgment of the soul. For generations, common Egyptians lived with that promise, that death was not the end, that on the other side there was a judgment where the heart was weighed against a feather, and then an eternal life in the blessed fields. It was the consolation of an entire people in the face of the death of a child, a wife, a father. Akhenaten took that away. In the new religion, Osiris did not exist. The world of the dead ruled by Osiris did not exist. The only source of life was the Aten, the sun, and the only intermediary was the Pharaoh. The common people's hope of eternity, which had depended on neither kings nor priests, was simply abolished by decree. A mother before a tomb without the old symbols of consolation, the emptiness. Imagine what that meant. It wasn't just changing the name of a god on a temple wall. It was telling a grieving mother that the God she prayed to for her son's soul did not exist, that the eternal life she imagined for him was not so. It was ripping away a people's deepest consolation and offering almost nothing in its place, except the worship of a disk in the sky, accessible only through the pharaoh and his family. This is why many historians believe Akhenaten's revolution never truly reached the heart of the people, and archaeology confirms it in a moving way. Excavations in the houses of the common workers of Amarna, the very city of the Aten, found hidden amulets of the old gods. There's the dwarf protector of the home and of childbirth, Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess who protected pregnant women. Small images of the forbidden gods kept inside the home. Think about this. In the city built to worship a single god, inside their own houses, the people hid the old gods. They obeyed the pharaoh in public, in the street, in the temple. But in secret, at night, in their rooms, they went on praying as their grandparents had prayed. The revolution was at the top. Below, the old faith simply hid and waited. Hook. And it would not have to wait long, because Akhenaten, the pharaoh who seemed unshakable in his sacred desert, was mortal. And when death came, everything he had built collapsed with a speed no one could have predicted. Within a few years, it was as if he had never existed. Akhenaten reigned about 17 years, and then he died. How, we don't know for certain. Where his body is also a matter of debate. There is a mummy found in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings that may be his, but the identification is not certain. The man who changed Egypt left us not even the certainty of his own corpse. What followed his death was swift and relentless. The revolution had no roots. It depended entirely on the will of one man. Without him, it fell. There were one or two brief and obscure successors, perhaps including, as we saw, Nefertiti herself under another name. And then the throne passed to a boy of about 9 years old. A boy whose name you know, though you may not have known his connection to all this. The boy had been born with a name in honor of the Aten, Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. But under the guidance of advisors and the old priesthood returning to power, that name was changed. The Aten went out, and Amun came back. The boy became known as Tutankhamun. Yes, the famous Tutankhamun, the pharaoh of the Golden Mask, of the nearly intact tomb discovered in 1922, is the boy who undid his father's revolution. Under his reign, the temples of Amun reopened. Power returned to the priests, the old gods were restored, and Amarna, the city of the sun, was abandoned to the desert sand. Within a few decades, it became a ruin. But Egypt was not content merely to undo. It wanted to erase. The pharaohs who came after treated Akhenaten as a shame to be eliminated. His name was removed from the official lists of kings, as if he had never reigned, as if there were a hole in time where he had stood. His monuments were demolished. The beautiful blocks of his temples, decorated with scenes of the Aten, were torn out and reused as mere rubble, stuffed into the fill of new buildings, with the decorated face turned inward, hidden. In later documents, when they had to refer to him, they did not use his name. They called him only the enemy or the criminal of Akhenaten. The man who had ordered Amun erased from all the stone of Egypt was himself erased from the stone of Egypt. The revenge of history was perfect, symmetrical, and cruel. Hook, And here is the most extraordinary irony of the whole story. That erasure was so complete that for more than 3,000 years, Akhenaten vanished from human memory. No one knew he had existed. The heretic Pharaoh was struck from time, until in the 19th century he began to be pulled back out of the sand, and what was discovered changed our understanding of religion forever. The rediscovery of Akhenaten happened gradually, and almost by accident. In the 19th century, as Egyptology was being born, and scholars began to excavate and decipher the hieroglyphs, they kept running into something they didn't understand. Inside ancient monuments, hidden as rubble in the fill of the walls, appeared blocks decorated in a style of art unlike anything else, and the name and the face of a pharaoh who appeared on no list of kings. Who was this king with no name on the lists, whose image someone had worked so hard to hide? The excavations at Amarna itself gradually revealed the ghost city of the Aten, the tombs with the hymn to the sun carved on the walls, the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose, where the bust of Nefertiti had lain forgotten for 3 millennia, intact, waiting, and the archive of diplomatic letters, which opened the window onto the collapse of the empire. Piece by piece, the archaeologists reconstructed the story of a pharaoh that Egypt itself had tried to erase from existence, and they realized the magnitude of what they held. Not a minor forgotten king, but perhaps the most radical episode in all the history of ancient Egypt, and one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire ancient world. The 3,000-year effort to erase Akhenaten failed, and it failed in a way with a deep irony. Today, the pharaoh Egypt wanted to forget is one of the most famous of all. His face is in museums around the world. The bust of his queen is one of the most recognized works of art there is, displayed in Berlin, visited by crowds. Books, documentaries, endless academic debates. The harder they tried to erase him, the more permanent, in the end, he became. And it was when they finally managed to read his words, his hymn to the sun, that the scholars had the greatest shock of all. Because in that Egyptian poem, written to a single god, there were echoes of something they knew very well. Something from the other side of the desert, something from the Bible. When scholars read the great hymn to the Aten carefully, some of them noticed something that left them perplexed. The hymn, written in Egypt around 1340 BC, in praise of a single God who creates all life, bears remarkable similarities to a text that would be written centuries later, Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible. Both texts praise a single God who creates and sustains the world. Both speak of the dawn that brings life and the night when the creatures withdraw. Both describe a creator who cares for every living being, from the greatest to the smallest. The similarities of image and structure are real enough that generations of scholars have placed the two texts side by side and wondered whether it could be coincidence. And this opened one of the most provocative questions in the history of religions. Was Akhenaten the first monotheist in history? And if he was, could the idea of a single God, which would later become the heart of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have some distant connection to that heretic pharaoh of the Egyptian desert? Here I need to be very honest with you, because this is the ground where most people overreach, and your trust is worth more than an easy click. First, what Akhenaten practiced may not even be monotheism in the full sense. Many scholars prefer to call it henotheism or monolatry, the exclusive worship of one God, without necessarily denying in absolute terms that others exist, although Akhenaten came very close to total denial. It is a real technical debate among specialists, and it is not settled. Second, and more important, there is no proof of a direct connection between Akhenaten and Moses, or between the religion of the Aten and the religion of Israel. The idea is old and seductive, raised even by famous names like Sigmund Freud, who wrote an entire book speculating about it, but it remains speculation, not fact. The dates, the sources, and the paths by which an idea might have passed from one to the other are all uncertain. Anyone who tells you with certainty that Moses copied Akhenaten, or that one was the other, is going far beyond what the evidence allows. As for the similarities between the hymn to the Aten and Psalm 104, the scholars themselves disagree. Some think they indicate a cultural influence that traveled across the Near East over the centuries, hand to hand, language to language. Others think they are simply the natural way any ancient people would praise a god of the sun and of creation, with no copying needed. There is no closed answer. What is honest to say is this: Akhenaten was, as far as we know, one of the first times in recorded history that an entire state was pushed toward the exclusive worship of a single god. Centuries before the idea of one god would spread across the world and change humanity forever. Whether there was influence or not, he got there first, and he failed. And perhaps it is precisely in that failure that the deepest lesson of his story lies. So what do we do with Akhenaten? For a long time, he was painted in two opposite ways. To some, a visionary, a spiritual genius ahead of his time. The first man to glimpse a single universal god, a poet of light. To others, a fanatic, an obsessed tyrant who neglected his people, lost allies and territory, and imposed his personal obsession on millions of people who never asked for it. The truth, most likely, is that he was both at once. And that is what makes him so fascinating 3,300 years later. Akhenaten shows us something unsettling about absolute power, that a single man, convinced he is right, with enough power in his hands, can try to rewrite the soul of an entire civilization. He can order gods erased. He can build cities in the desert. He can rip away a people's hope and replace it with his own private vision. And he shows us the limit of that too, because the people, down below, kept their amulets hidden inside their homes. They waited, and when the man died, the old faith came back from the sand, and it was his vision that turned to dust. The man who tried to erase the gods was erased, and then dug back up. And today his strange face is in museums around the world, and the name Egypt tried to destroy is spoken by millions of people who have never set foot in Egypt. In a way, in the end, it was Akhenaten who achieved the immortality he so desperately sought, just not in the way he imagined, not in the eternal fields of his sun god, but in the memory and the curiosity of a world that 3,000 years later still cannot stop talking about him. If this story held you all the way here, it is only the beginning. Egypt is full of pharaohs, queens, and mysteries like this, and I will bring each one of them here on the channel with the same depth. Nefertiti herself, whose fate was left open in this video, deserves her own story, and it's coming. So you don't miss it, subscribe and hit the bell. And if you enjoy this kind of documentary and you want me to keep diving deep into these stories, you can now support the channel through super thanks right below the video. Every bit of support, however small, helps produce the next documentary. It's between us that this channel grows. And tell me in the comments, do you see Akhenaten as a visionary ahead of his time, or as a fanatic who almost destroyed Egypt? I read every answer, because the story doesn't end here.